My finger hovered over the confirmation button, trembling so badly that I had to grip my phone with both hands. One tap. That was all it would take to send another $1,500, the same amount I had sent every single month for the past 2 years. Money I no longer had. Money that was supposed to keep my sister alive. If I pressed that button, I wouldn't be able to pay my rent. I already knew that. I had done the math 3 times, hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. But my mother's words echoed in my head, sharp and desperate. If you don't send it today, the doctors won't continue her treatment. I was 32 years old, standing alone in a quiet parking lot, about to give away the very last of my savings again. And what scared me most wasn't the thought of being broke. It was the crushing fear that if I stopped sending money, my sister might die, and I would have to live with that guilt for the rest of my life. This wasn't how my life was supposed to look. I had a good job, a future I'd worked for, dreams I kept putting on hold. But for 2 years, everything had revolved around my sister's sudden illness. Every emergency call, every tearful voicemail, every new medical expense that somehow wasn't covered by insurance. I never questioned it. I couldn't. Questioning it felt cruel, almost evil, when someone's life was supposedly on the line. As I stared at my phone, trying to steady my breathing, a voice cut through the silence behind me. "Don't send that money." I froze. I turned around to see someone I hadn't expected, someone who had no reason to involve themselves in my family's business. Her face was pale, her expression tense, and when she reached for my wrist, her grip was firm, almost urgent. "Please," she whispered, lowering her voice as if the house itself might hear us. "Before you send anything else, you need to go inside and look for yourself." My heart started pounding. "Look at what?" I asked. She hesitated, then said something that made my stomach drop. "The things your mother doesn't want you to see." I didn't know it yet, but that moment, the moment my finger lifted away from the screen, was the last time I would ever see my family the same way again. What I was about to discover would unravel 2 years of lies, expose a betrayal I never imagined, and force me to make the hardest decision of my life. So please, stay with me, because the truth I uncovered that day didn't just change my relationship with my sister. It destroyed the illusion of family I had been sacrificing everything for. And once you hear what I found, you'll understand why I never sent that money. My name is Audrey. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as reliable, the one who answers the phone no matter the hour, the one who doesn't complain, the one who always finds a way to make things work even when they shouldn't. I work in operations for a logistics company in Chicago. It's not glamorous, but it pays steadily. And I've built my position from the ground up, starting years ago washing dishes, then taking on night shifts, then slowly clawing my way into an office role through grit and exhaustion. From the outside, my life probably looks stable, organized, controlled. But what most people don't know is that for the past 2 years, nearly everything I earned had already been spent before it even reached my bank account. Every month, without fail, $1,500 left my hands and went straight to my family back home. Not for rent, not for food, not for myself. It went toward keeping my younger sister alive, or so I believed. This story didn't begin 2 years ago. It started much earlier, on a rain-soaked afternoon when I was 16 years old, standing in a funeral home that smelled faintly of flowers and polish. My father's coffin sat at the front of the room, sealed shut, heavy and final. The sound of rain hitting the windows was so loud it felt like the world itself was mourning him. My father had been killed in an accident at the steel mill where he worked. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, leaving behind debt, a house we could barely afford, and 3 women who had no idea how to survive without him. That day, standing there in a borrowed black dress that didn't quite fit, I made a promise. Not out loud, not to anyone else, just to myself. I promised I would step into his place. I promised I would protect my family, no matter what it cost me. At 16, I didn't understand how dangerous that promise was. After my father died, my mother changed. Grief hollowed her out and filled the empty space with fear. She became obsessed with the idea of losing someone else, and that fear wrapped itself tightly around my younger sister, Whitney. Whitney was always described as fragile, too sensitive, too delicate, too soft for the world. My mother decided it was her job to shield Whitney from pain, every pain, no matter the cost. That cost became me. While Whitney was protected, I was expected to be unbreakable. I worked after school at a diner, double shifts on weekends, and came home smelling like grease and coffee. I handed my paychecks to my mother without question. When I received an acceptance letter from a nearby university, I folded it and tucked it into a drawer, knowing we couldn't afford tuition and a mortgage at the same time. Whitney grew up believing the world would always catch her when she fell. I grew up believing it was my responsibility to be the ground. By the time I moved out, I was already trained to sacrifice. I moved 3 hours away to Chicago because the pay was better, not because I wanted a fresh start. I lived in basement apartments with leaking pipes. I skipped meals. I wore shoes until the soles cracked. And still, every month, I sent money home. Then, 2 years ago, everything escalated. It was a Tuesday night when my mother called me, her voice trembling so badly I thought she was about to drop the phone. She told me Whitney had suddenly become seriously ill. The diagnosis was complicated. She said something autoimmune, aggressive, difficult to treat. Doctors were running tests. Specialists were involved. Treatments were expensive, experimental, and only partially covered by insurance. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall while she spoke, my mind racing ahead of her words. All I could think was, this can't be happening. Not her. From that moment on, my life narrowed. Whitney's illness became the center of every conversation. Every call came with new urgency, new costs, new reasons why money was needed immediately. My mother told me Whitney was exhausted all the time, in constant pain, barely able to get out of bed. She said my sister felt ashamed, that she didn't want me to see her like that. I offered to come home. My mother refused. She doesn't want you to remember her this way, she said. She's losing her hair. She cries all the time. So I stayed away. I trusted them. Every month, I wired $1,500, sometimes more. I sold my car and bought a rusted replacement just to cover an unexpected complication. I took on night cleaning jobs after already working full days. My world became a cycle of work, exhaustion, guilt, and transfers. And somehow, it was never enough. If I hesitated, my mother cried. If I asked questions, she accused me of not caring enough. I felt selfish buying myself a coffee, knowing my sister was supposedly fighting for her life. I told myself this was what love looked like. That belief carried me all the way to the moment when I stood in that quiet parking lot, phone shaking in my hands, about to send the last money I had. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that the story I had been living was built on something far darker than desperation. And once I finally allowed myself to look closer, everything I thought I knew about my family began to unravel. At first, I told myself the situation was temporary. Illness, especially the kind my mother described, came in waves. There would be a crisis, then a calm period. That's what I clung to in the beginning, the idea that if I could just push a little harder now, things would eventually stabilize. They didn't. Instead, the requests became routine, almost scheduled. The 15th of every month wasn't just payday anymore. It was the day my phone would ring, and my chest would tighten before I even answered. Sometimes my mother called crying, sometimes exhausted, sometimes eerily calm, as if she were reading from a script she had memorized too well. She had a bad night. The specialist changed her treatment again. The insurance rejected the claim. Each sentence landed the same way, heavy, final, unquestionable. At first, I asked for updates. How was Whitney feeling? Was she eating? Was the pain getting better or worse? My mother always answered, but her responses grew shorter over time, more vague. Whitney, I was told, slept most of the day. Talking made her tired. Stress made her condition worse. Eventually, I was told it would be best if I didn't call her directly at all. "She needs peace," my mother said, "and hearing your voice only reminds her of the life she's losing." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. I replayed it every time I thought about picking up the phone. I didn't want to be selfish. I didn't want to make things harder for her, so I stopped asking. I noticed changes in my own life long before I noticed the cracks in theirs. My savings vanished first, then my emergency fund, then the small comforts I had built for myself, things I'd once believed were proof that I was finally doing okay. I canceled subscriptions, skipped doctor appointments, ignored the warning lights in my car. When my landlord raised the rent, I took on another night job instead of complaining. I learned how to live in a permanent state of exhaustion. There were nights I fell asleep, still wearing my coat, my phone clutched in my hand in case my mother called with another emergency. Nights when my alarm went off, and I couldn't remember when I'd last eaten something that wasn't from a vending machine. I told myself it didn't matter. Whitney mattered. Family mattered. What I didn't realize was how carefully I was being isolated. Whenever I mentioned visiting, my mother found a reason to stop me. Whitney had a reaction to a new medication. She was feeling too weak. The doctors advised against visitors. Once, my mother snapped at me in a way I'd never heard before, accusing me of wanting to satisfy my own guilt instead of respecting my sister's dignity. I apologized immediately. Looking back now, that should have been my first real warning. But at the time, guilt made me blind. I believed love meant enduring discomfort without complaint. I believed that if I just trusted them, everything would make sense in the end. Money became the language we spoke. When I sent it, things were calm. When I hesitated, chaos followed. I started wiring the $1,500 automatically, without waiting for a call, hoping it would prevent another crisis. It didn't. There was always something extra, new equipment, new therapy, new complications that somehow required immediate payment. 1 month, I sold my car. It was the only reliable thing I owned, the one symbol that I was finally moving forward in life. I replaced it with a rusted junker that rattled every time I turned the key. I told myself it was temporary. Everything was temporary. I remember standing in the parking lot of the dealership after handing over the keys, staring at the empty space where my car had been. I felt numb, not sad, not angry, just hollow, as if something inside me had quietly shut down. And still, I kept going. The strangest part was how normal my mother sounded during those calls. She cried, yes, but there were moments when her voice slipped into something lighter, almost distracted. She'd mention small, irrelevant things before catching herself and returning to the script of worry and fear. I noticed it, but I didn't let myself think about it. It's amazing how much the human mind will ignore when acknowledging the truth feels too dangerous. Months passed like this. One bled into the next until time lost its shape. I stopped making plans for the future because the present required everything I had. I told myself I would rest later. I would live later. I would be happy later. Then, 3 months ago, something happened that disrupted the rhythm I'd been trapped in. My company scheduled an unexpected business trip. When I saw the route, my stomach dropped. I would be driving straight past my hometown. Not visiting, just passing by. The exit sign flashed in my mind like a warning. At first, I told myself not to go. Showing up unannounced felt wrong, intrusive. My mother had been very clear about that. But as the miles stretched out in front of me, a different feeling crept in. A quiet, stubborn need I couldn't explain. I hadn't seen my sister in 2 years. I had sent tens of thousands of dollars. I had reorganized my entire life around her illness. And yet, I couldn't picture her face anymore, not clearly. The image in my mind was frozen in time, a version of her from before everything changed. I told myself I just wanted to leave groceries, maybe a note, something to show her she wasn't alone. So I took the exit. The closer I got to the house I grew up in, the more uneasy I felt. I expected urgency, noise, some sign that a medical crisis lived there now. But when I pulled into the driveway, the silence was overwhelming. No car, no lights, the curtains drawn tight. I sat there with my engine running, my heart pounding in a way that felt different from the usual anxiety. This wasn't fear for Whitney. This was something colder, something sharp and unfamiliar. I picked up my phone to call my mother, already rehearsing the apology for showing up without warning. That was the moment before everything began to unravel, when I still believed there had to be a reasonable explanation. I just hadn't learned yet how wrong I was. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before getting out, my hands resting on the steering wheel as if it could anchor me. The house in front of me looked exactly the same as it had when I left years ago. Same peeling paint near the porch steps, same crooked mailbox, but something about it felt wrong. Not abandoned, exactly. Just empty, like a stage after the actors have left. I grabbed the grocery bag from the passenger seat and walked up the concrete path, half expecting the front door to swing open any second. It didn't. I rang the bell. Nothing. I knocked harder, then again, listening for movement inside. Still nothing. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and unsettling. I pulled out my phone and called my mother. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice burst through the speaker, breathless and frantic, as if I'd interrupted something urgent. "Audrey, what's wrong?" she asked. "I'm outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm at the house. Where are you?" There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. Oh, honey, you should have called first," she said quickly. "We're at the hospital. Whitney had a terrible reaction to the medication this morning. It's been awful." "And Teena'd work." My chest tightened instantly. "Which hospital?" I asked. "I can come there right now." "No," she said, almost shouting, then catching herself. Her voice dropped into a strained whisper. "No, you can't. She's vomiting constantly. She doesn't want you to see her like this. Please, Audrey, just go back to your hotel." Something in her tone made my stomach twist. It wasn't fear. It was urgency, but not the kind I'd heard before. "I already bought groceries," I said. "I'll just leave them inside." "Don't go in the house," she snapped. "It's a mess. Medical supplies everywhere. Germs. Just go. I'll call you later." And then she hung up. I stared at my phone, stunned. The call ended so abruptly, it felt like being pushed off a cliff mid-sentence. I stood there on the porch, the bag cutting into my fingers, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That was when I heard a voice from next door. "Audrey?" I turned and saw Mrs. Miller, our longtime neighbor, standing by the fence with a garden hose in her hand. She'd lived next door for as long as I could remember. She'd watched me grow up, watched my father leave for work every morning, watched my mother slowly withdraw after his death. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything. She looked at me now with an expression I couldn't quite read, concern mixed with something sharper. "Are you looking for your mother?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "She said they're at the hospital." Mrs. Miller let out a short laugh. It wasn't amused. It was bitter. "The hospital?" she repeated. Then she shook her head. "That's not where they went." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "I watched them leave this morning," she said, turning off the hose and setting it aside. "They got into a taxi around 6. Your sister was laughing. They had luggage, big luggage." I felt like the ground shifted under my feet. "That's not possible," I said. "My sister is very sick." Mrs. Miller stepped closer to the fence and lowered her voice. "Honey, I don't know what you've been told, but there was nothing sick about her. She carried a surfboard out of the garage like it weighed nothing." A surfboard. The word echoed in my head. Absurd and impossible. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. Every part of me wanted to reject what she was saying, to defend my mother, to explain it away. "You should go inside," Mrs. Miller said gently. "See for yourself." I walked back to the porch on legs that felt disconnected from my body. My thoughts raced, colliding into each other. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe. I reached into the planter by the door and lifted the loose brick where the spare key had always been hidden. My mother had never changed that habit. I slid the key into the lock. The door opened easily. The smell inside was wrong. No antiseptic, no medicine. Just stale air and faint lavender cleaner. The living room was tidy, almost too tidy. No equipment, no pill bottles, no signs of illness. I moved through the house slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The kitchen was clean, the bedrooms untouched. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I climbed the narrow stairs to the upper storage area, my hands shaking as I pulled the light cord. Dust floated through the air. Boxes were stacked along the walls, old decorations, forgotten memories. That's when I saw it. A large red suitcase sat in the corner, partially unzipped, like someone had been in a hurry. It was Whitney's. I recognized it instantly. She'd used it on college trips years ago. I knelt beside it and opened it fully. What I found inside stole the breath from my lungs. There were stacks of papers, hospital letterheads printed on cheap paper, invoices with mismatched fonts, forms filled out in uneven handwriting. I picked one up and realized with a sickening jolt that I was looking at practice sheets. Someone had been repeatedly signing the same doctor's name over and over, trying to get it right. My vision blurred as I dug deeper. More templates, more invoices, prices inflated, dates altered. A notebook fell open in my hands, pages filled with careful notes, not about treatment schedules, but expenses. Resort fees, clothing stores, bars. The room spun. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the realization pressed down on me so hard I thought I might collapse onto the dusty floor. 2 years. 2 years of fear, guilt, and exhaustion, and it was all built on this. A lie. My first instinct was to scream, to call my mother immediately and demand an explanation. But another voice, calmer, colder, cut through the chaos in my mind. If I confronted them now, they would deny everything. They would destroy this, and I would be left with nothing but my own disbelief. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I put everything back exactly where I found it. I zipped the suitcase closed. I wiped my fingerprints from the handle with my sleeve. Then I took photos carefully, quietly documenting every page. I locked the door behind me and walked back to my car. As I drove away from the house, my hands were steady for the first time in years. Whatever this was, whatever my family had turned into, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to be their victim anymore. I didn't cry when I got back into my car. That surprised me. For 2 years, I had lived with a constant knot in my chest, fear, guilt, exhaustion tangled together so tightly I thought they were permanent. But as I drove away from the house, that knot didn't explode into panic the way I expected. It tightened, yes, but it also sharpened. Fear was slowly being replaced by something else. Clarity. I checked into a small hotel on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. I sat on the bed without turning on the lights, my phone glowing in my hands as I scrolled through the photos I had taken in the attic. Hospital logos, invoices, signatures. Every image felt unreal, like evidence from someone else's life. I kept waiting for doubt to rush in, for my mind to scramble for excuses, but the longer I stared, the quieter those excuses became. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts ran in circles, replaying every conversation I'd had with my mother over the past 2 years. Every time she'd cried, every time she'd urged me to hurry, every time she'd warned me not to ask too many questions. I realized, with a sick heaviness, how carefully the story had been managed. By morning, I knew I couldn't rely on instinct alone. I needed confirmation, not suspicion, not emotion, proof that couldn't be undone with denial. I sat at the small desk by the window, sunlight filtering through thin curtains, and picked up my phone. My hands were steady as I dialed the number printed on one of the oncology department letterheads. It rang several times before an automated voice answered, guiding me through a maze of menu options. I listened patiently, my heart pounding harder with every second. When a real person finally came on the line, her voice sounded tired but polite. Oncology department, how can I help you? I swallowed. Hi, I'm calling to check on a patient, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. Her name is Whitney. I gave my sister's full legal name, her date of birth, the details my mother had repeated so often I knew them by heart. There was a pause as the woman typed. I'm sorry, she said slowly. Can you repeat the name? I did. Another pause. Longer this time. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I'm not seeing any patient by that name in our system." A chill ran through me. "Could you check past records?" I asked. "She's been undergoing treatment for a while." I heard keys clicking again, then silence. "I've checked our current and archived records," she said. "There's no record of a patient by that name here." My throat went dry. I hesitated, then pushed further. "What about the physician listed on the paperwork? Dr. Wilson?" She exhaled softly. "We don't have a doctor by that name in this department." That was it. The last thread holding my denial together snapped. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there staring at the wall, my reflection faint in the dark screen of my phone. The room felt too quiet, as if the truth had sucked all the sound out of it. But I wasn't done. If my mother had been lying, then other people had to know. Not doctors, not specialists. People who had been close enough to see behind the curtain. There was one name I hadn't allowed myself to think about until then. Rick, Whitney's ex-boyfriend. They dated right before her diagnosis. My mother had said he left because he couldn't handle her illness, that he was weak, selfish. I had accepted that explanation without question. Now, I wasn't so sure. It took some digging, but I found his number. I texted him instead of calling, unsure how he would react. I told him who I was and asked if we could talk. An hour passed, then 2. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed. "Fine," the message read. "Coffee shop on Route 9, noon." Rick looked older than I remembered when he walked in. Tired. His hands were rough, his clothes stained with oil and grease. He sat across from me cautiously, his posture guarded. "What's this about?" he asked. "I didn't waste time. Why did you and Whitney really break up?" He laughed, sharp, humorless. "Is this a joke?" My stomach sank. "My mother said you couldn't handle her illness. Discoming." Rick shook his head slowly. "That's what she told you?" "Yes." He leaned back, running a hand over his face. "I left because she refused to work, because she expected me to pay for everything, because every time I questioned where the money was going, she'd accuse me of not loving her enough." He pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. "You should see this." The screen lit up with a social media profile I'd never seen before. My sister's face stared back at me, healthy, glowing, smiling. Video after video showed her dancing in crowded clubs, sipping expensive drinks, laughing under neon lights. The dates were recent. "She was too sick to see you last month," Rick said quietly. But she wasn't too sick for this. I felt nauseous. I scrolled further. There were photos from beaches, resorts, designer stores. And then my chest tightened. I saw my mother in the background of one of them, smiling into the camera, holding a cocktail. In that moment, something shifted permanently. My mother wasn't being manipulated. She was complicit. I left the cafe in a daze, the sunlight outside too bright, too normal for the world I now understood. By the time I got back to my hotel room, the shock had settled into something colder and more focused. Anger, yes, but controlled. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone, knowing what I had to do next. Confronting them now would only give them time to prepare, to lie, to destroy evidence. I needed them to feel safe, confident, greedy. I needed them to underestimate me one last time. That evening, as the sky darkened outside my window, I dialed my mother's number. When she answered, her voice was heavy with familiar sorrow, practiced and convincing. I took a breath and played my role perfectly. "Mom," I said, forcing excitement into my voice, "you won't believe what just happened at work today." The trap was set. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as the phone rang. 1 ring, 2, 3, I reminded myself to breathe. I had rehearsed this moment in my head over and over, but now that it was happening, my palms were slick with sweat. I wasn't calling my mother as her daughter. I was calling her as an actor, stepping onto a stage I had finally learned how to see. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice heavy and fragile, soaked in the familiar sorrow she had perfected over the years. "Audrey?" she said softly. "Is everything okay?" I forced a laugh, light and breathless. the kind that signals excitement. "Mom, you are not going to believe what just happened." There was a pause. I could almost hear her recalibrating. "What is it?" she asked, her tone shifting just enough to reveal curiosity beneath the concern. "I got promoted," I said. "Out of nowhere. The company restructured, and they offered me a regional position. They're giving me a signing bonus. It would also stand for..." The silence on the other end of the line lasted half a second, just long enough to be noticeable. Then her voice brightened in a way that made my stomach twist. That's wonderful, honey," she said, though the words felt rushed, like an obligation she needed to get past. "How much?" 50,000, I replied, letting the number hang in the air. "In cash." The reaction was immediate. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Audrey, that's a miracle." A miracle. Not for me. Not for my years of exhaustion or sacrifice. For her. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't ask if I was happy. Instead, she launched straight into it, her voice trembling with urgency that now sounded almost eager. "You have no idea how perfect the timing is," she said. "Just this morning, the specialist told us Whitney needs an emergency procedure. They can't wait anymore. If we don't act now." Her voice cracked dramatically. I could picture her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes squeezed shut, the performance flawless. "How much does it cost?" I asked quietly. There was no hesitation. "Exactly that," she said. 50,000. Every cent. I closed my eyes. 2 years ago, that lie would have shattered me. I would have panicked, rushed, wired the money without thinking. Now, all I felt was a cold clarity settle into my bones. "I want to help," I said slowly. "Of course I do. But I don't trust transferring that much electronically. There are delays, errors. I don't want to risk anything." She exhaled sharply, irritation creeping into her voice. "Audrey, there's no time for this. Whitney is suffering." "I know," I said gently. "That's why I want to bring it myself. I'll drive in this weekend. I want to see her before the surgery." "No," she snapped, then softened. "I mean, that might be too stressful for her. I need to see her," I repeated. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. There was muffled movement on the other end of the line. Then the phone shifted, and a new voice burst through the speaker loud, sharp, impatient. "Are you serious right now?" Whitney snapped. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I froze. This was the first time I'd heard my sister's voice in months. And there was nothing weak or tired about it. No strain, no pain. "Whitney?" I said softly. "You need to bring the money," she said. "All of it, in cash. I can't wait for banks or paperwork. I'm in too much pain." Her words landed wrong. Too fast. Too demanding. "I'll be there Saturday," I said. "I promise." "Don't be late," she replied. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my entire body trembling, not with fear, but with something closer to grief. Hearing her voice like that confirmed everything. The illness, the weakness, the shame. It had all been fiction. I sat on the edge of the bed in my hotel room, staring at the wall as the enormity of what I was about to do settled in. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about ending something that had consumed my life. I made one more call that night. My attorney answered immediately. He'd known me for years, had watched me work myself into the ground, had gently suggested boundaries I never took seriously. When I explained what I'd discovered, his voice turned professional, precise. "Do not confront them until we're ready," he said. "Let them believe the money is real. We need documentation, clear intent." I hung up feeling both terrified and resolute. Saturday came faster than I expected. I rented a black sedan, something sleek and unfamiliar, and drove back to the house I'd grown up in. The leather briefcase beside me felt heavier than it should have, even though it didn't contain a single dollar. I parked behind my mother's car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't afraid of them. I was afraid of what it would mean to finally see them clearly. I didn't knock. I walked straight in. The living room had been transformed. Furniture pushed aside. A rented hospital bed placed in the center. Whitney lay on it, wrapped in blankets, a scarf tied around her head. My mother rushed toward me, hands clasped, tears streaming down her face. "You're just in time," she whispered. She's fading. Whitney let out a theatrical groan, shifting under the covers. I watched her carefully, the way she moved too easily, the way her breathing remained steady. I placed the briefcase on the coffee table and sat down calmly in my father's old chair. Before I give you anything, I said evenly, I need to understand the treatment plan. My mother stiffened. What do you mean? She asked. Details, I said. The anesthesiologist, the recovery protocol, the hospital schedule. They exchanged a glance. Well, it's complicated, my mother said quickly. Medical terms. You wouldn't. I checked the hospital records yesterday, I said softly. The room went silent. There's no surgery scheduled, I continued. There's no doctor by that name. And there has never been. My mother's face drained of color. I opened the briefcase. Instead of cash, I pulled out photographs, documents, proof. And in that moment, as their carefully built world began to collapse, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. For a moment, no one spoke. The photographs lay scattered across the coffee table and the rented hospital bed like fallen leaves, bright, undeniable fragments of a life my sister was never supposed to have while she was dying. Images of her laughing in crowded clubs, holding cocktails on a beach, smiling under the sun in places I had paid for without ever knowing their names. Whitney stared at them, her mouth slightly open, as if her brain hadn't yet caught up with what her eyes were seeing. My mother's hands trembled as she picked one up, her fingers pressing into the glossy paper hard enough to leave creases. This isn't what it looks like, she whispered. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what it looked like. Whitney suddenly sat up in the hospital bed. The movement was fast, instinctive, and completely unrestrained. The blanket slid off her legs, and in her panic, she forgot to keep pretending. She forgot to moan, forgot to act weak. She was breathing normally, moving easily. She ripped the scarf from her head and flung it across the room, revealing thick, healthy hair that shone under the overhead light. The sight hit me harder than any of the documents had. 2 years. 2 years of watching my savings disappear. 2 years of sleeping in my clothes. 2 years of living with a knot of fear in my chest, believing my sister was wasting away somewhere, ashamed and suffering. And there she was, whole, strong, angry. You ruined everything, Whitney screamed, scrambling off the bed. You had no right. My mother dropped the photo and turned on her. You said you could handle it, she snapped. You said you wouldn't get careless. The argument exploded so quickly it felt rehearsed, like they'd been holding it in, waiting for the moment the mask finally slipped. This was your idea, Whitney shouted. You're the one who told me to cry on the phone. You're the one who said she'd never question us. Thanks for watching. My mother's face twisted, rage and fear colliding. I did this for the family, she yelled back. For the house. For stability. I stood there, motionless, watching them unravel each other in front of me, watching the people I had sacrificed my youth for tear each other apart without a second thought. It was grotesque. Stop, I said quietly. They didn't hear me. Whitney lunged toward my mother, shoving her backward. My mother stumbled and fell to the floor, landing hard on the scattered photographs. Papers slid everywhere, further exposing the lies they had lived inside for so long. You're not going to blame this on me, Whitney screamed. You loved the money. You loved pretending you were still important. That was when my mother broke. She crawled toward me on her knees, her hands reaching out desperately. Tears streamed down her face, real this time, not practiced, not controlled. Audrey, please, she sobbed. I'm your mother. I didn't know how else to keep everything together. Whitney pressured me. She wanted more and more, and I was afraid to lose her. I looked down at her and felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just an overwhelming emptiness where love used to live. I checked everything, I said calmly. The hospitals, the doctors, the records, none of it exists. Her sobbing turned into gasps. And because the money crossed state lines, I continued, my voice steady despite the way my hands trembled. This isn't just a family issue anymore. The room went silent. What are you saying? My mother whispered. I'm saying I've already spoken to a lawyer, I replied. And I'm saying that the documents you asked me to bring today were never money. Whitney froze. "What?" she said sharply. I reached into the briefcase one last time and pulled out a thin stack of papers. Not photographs, not bank statements, legal documents. "These are formal complaints," I said. "Fraud, deception, solicitation under false pretenses." My mother let out a sound that barely resembled a cry. "You wouldn't," she said weakly. "You wouldn't do this to your own family." I met her eyes. "You did this to me first." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Whitney backed away slowly, shaking her head. "You're bluffing," she muttered. "You don't have it in you." Adie said. I closed the briefcase and stood up. "You taught me I didn't have a choice," I said. "You just never imagined I'd use that lesson against you." They kept shouting as I walked toward the door, pleading, accusing, bargaining. My mother promised she'd pay me back. Whitney screamed that I was heartless, ungrateful, cruel. None of it reached me anymore. I stepped outside into the cold air, my lungs filling for the first time in what felt like years. Their voices followed me down the driveway, but I didn't turn around. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. My heart was racing, but beneath it was something unfamiliar. Lightness, not happiness, not relief, something quieter, freedom. As I drove away from the house, I realized I wasn't mourning the family I was leaving behind. I was mourning the version of myself who believed love meant endurance at any cost. And as painful as that realization was, it was also the moment I knew with absolute certainty that I would never send another dollar, and I would never let them touch my life again. The drive back to my hotel felt longer than it should have. Every red light, every stretch of empty road gave my mind space to replay what had just happened, as if my brain were trying to prove to itself that it was real. I kept expecting a wave of panic to crash over me, regret, doubt, the instinct to turn around and fix things. That was how I'd lived for most of my life. Something went wrong, and it was my job to make it right. But this time, nothing came. Instead, there was a strange stillness. My chest felt hollow, but not in a painful way. It was the quiet left behind after a storm finally passes, when the air smells cleaner but the damage hasn't fully revealed itself yet. That night, I slept for nearly 12 hours straight. It was the deepest sleep I'd had in years. No phone calls, no buzzing anxiety pulling me out of unconsciousness. When I woke up, sunlight filled the room, and for a brief moment, I didn't remember why I was there. Then it all rushed back, but it didn't knock the breath out of me the way it used to. I called my attorney first thing that morning. He listened without interrupting as I described what had happened inside the house. The rented bed, the confrontation, the evidence. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "And you did it the smart way." Those words mattered more than I expected. For so long, I had been told directly or indirectly that my instincts were selfish, that my questions were cruel, that my hesitation meant I didn't care enough. Hearing someone tell me I had acted correctly felt like permission to trust myself again. The process moved forward quickly after that. I provided everything. I had photos, call logs, bank records, timelines. Seeing the total amount I'd sent laid out on paper made my stomach turn. Tens of thousands of dollars. Money I'd earned one exhausted hour at a time. It was overwhelming, but it was also grounding. Facts replaced fear. I returned to Chicago a few days later, stepping back into my apartment like someone entering a place they hadn't realized they'd been locked out of. For the first time in years, my space felt like mine. Quiet didn't feel threatening. Silence wasn't something I needed to fill with worry. That didn't mean the emotional fallout didn't come. It hit in waves, unexpected and disorienting. One moment I felt calm, almost numb. The next, I'd be standing in the grocery store, staring at a shelf, suddenly furious over something small and insignificant. Sometimes I felt grief so sharp it made my throat ache, not for the family I had lost, but for the years of myself I would never get back. I started therapy. That decision alone felt like a rebellion. Growing up, asking for help had always been framed as weakness. You endured, you adapted. You didn't burden others with your feelings. Sitting in a quiet room, Saying out loud that I had been manipulated by the people who were supposed to protect me was harder than any confrontation I'd had with my mother or sister. But it was necessary. My therapist helped me see something I'd never considered before. I wasn't just generous. I had been trained to be useful at the expense of my own needs. I had learned early that love was conditional, that it depended on what I provided, how much I gave, how quiet I stayed. Understanding that didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape, and shape made it manageable. A few weeks later, I heard through my attorney that my mother and Whitney had accepted responsibility for what they'd done. There were legal consequences, financial ones mostly, agreements, conditions. I didn't attend any hearings. I didn't need to see them again to feel closure. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt when I heard the news. There was no triumphant rush, no sense of victory, just a sober acknowledgement that actions have consequences, and those consequences were no longer mine to carry. I blocked their numbers. That step felt final in a way nothing else had. No dramatic speeches, no last messages, just silence chosen, intentional silence. At first, I checked my phone compulsively, half expecting to see missed calls or messages slipping through. When none came, I felt both relief and sadness in equal measure. Letting go, I learned, is rarely clean. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. I still worked long hours. I still worried about money. But the difference was subtle and profound. My paycheck stayed where it belonged. I could plan again. I could think about the future without calculating how much of it I was obligated to give away. I bought myself a decent meal without guilt. I fixed things in my apartment I'd been ignoring for years. Small things, but they felt monumental. One evening, while sitting on my balcony with a cup of tea, I realized I wasn't bracing myself for the next crisis. That constant readiness, the tension I'd carried like a second spine, was gone. In its place was uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. I still think about my mother and sister sometimes, not with longing, not with anger, mostly with a distant sadness for what they chose to become. I don't wonder if I made the right decision anymore. I know I did. Because love that requires you to disappear isn't love. It's control. And kindness that destroys you isn't kindness at all. Walking away didn't make me heartless. It made me whole. And for the first time since I was 16 years old, I'm living a life that actually belongs to me. Time moved differently after everything ended. Days stopped blurring together, but they didn't snap into clarity either. Instead, they unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if my life was relearning how to breathe. A month passed before I heard anything concrete. Then another. I didn't chase updates, and I didn't ask my attorney to call me unless there was something I needed to know. For once, I wasn't responsible for managing a crisis. That alone felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. When the call finally came, I was sitting at my desk at work, sorting through invoices that suddenly felt trivial compared to the weight they used to carry. My attorney's name flashed on my phone, and for a split second, my stomach tightened out of habit, but the panic didn't come. "They've accepted a plea," he said once I stepped into a quiet conference room. His voice was calm, businesslike. "It avoids prison time, but there are strict conditions: full-time employment, restitution, probation, financial oversight." I leaned against the window and closed my eyes. "And the house?" I asked. There was a pause. "The bank has already initiated foreclosure. The mortgage hadn't been kept up. It'll be sold at auction." I thanked him and ended the call, staring out at the city below. Cars moved through intersections. People hurried along sidewalks. Life went on with or without my permission. That night, I cried for the first time since everything happened. Not because I wanted them to get away with it. Not because I missed them. I cried because the house where I'd grown up, the place that held my father's laugh, my teenage fears, my first understanding of responsibility, was officially gone. It hurt more than I expected. A week later, I received a notice confirming the sale. Strangers would live there now. They'd paint over the walls where we'd marked our heights as kids. They'd never know how many nights I lay awake in that house, convincing myself that holding everything together was the same thing as being loved. I sat on my couch with the letter in my hands and let myself grieve it properly. Not the family, the illusion. Restitution came later. Not all at once, not enough to erase the damage, but enough to matter, enough to remind me that what I'd lost wasn't imaginary, and what had been taken from me was real. I used part of it to pay off lingering debts. The rest, I let sit untouched for weeks, unsure what it meant to spend money that wasn't already claimed by someone else's emergency. Eventually, I booked a trip. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet place I'd always wanted to see but never allowed myself to consider. Buying that ticket felt strange, almost rebellious. I kept waiting for guilt to rise up and scold me. It didn't. Around that time, I heard from Mrs. Miller. She sent a handwritten letter. The kind people don't write much anymore. She said she hoped I was doing well. She mentioned the weather, the neighborhood gossip, how different the street felt now. She didn't bring up my mother or Whitney directly, and I appreciated that more than I could explain. At the end, she wrote, "I'm glad you listened that day. You deserve peace." I cried again then, quietly, overwhelmed by the kindness of someone who had no obligation to me at all. I sent her a thank you package a week later. Nothing fancy, just a small gesture that felt necessary. She was the only person who had spoken up when it mattered most, and I never forgot that. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. My mother took a job bagging groceries. I didn't see her, but I heard about it through channels I didn't seek out. Whitney found work too, something physical and exhausting. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't dwell on it. Their lives were no longer my responsibility to monitor or judge. The strangest part was realizing how much space had been freed up in my mind. For years, my thoughts had orbited around other people's needs, what they wanted, what they expected, what they might demand next. Without that constant pull, my inner world felt unfamiliar, like a room I'd never been allowed to enter before. I started asking myself questions I'd avoided for decades. What do I want? What makes me feel safe? What does rest actually look like? The answers didn't come all at once. Some days, I felt strong and certain. Other days, I felt lost, unsure who I was without the role I'd been assigned at 16. But even on the hard days, one thing remained true. I no longer felt trapped. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped explaining myself to people who hadn't earned that access. I learned to say no without justifying it, and yes without bracing for punishment. And slowly, so slowly, I almost didn't notice, I began to trust my own judgment again. One evening, sitting on my balcony as the sun dipped behind the buildings, I realized I wasn't scanning my phone for missed calls. I wasn't calculating numbers in my head. I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I was just there, present, unburdened. The past didn't disappear. It never does. But it lost its grip on my throat. It became something I could look at without flinching, something that informed me rather than controlled me. I don't hate my mother or my sister. Hate would require a kind of emotional investment I no longer have. What I feel instead is a quiet certainty that walking away was the only way to survive. And survival, I've learned, isn't dramatic. It's gentle. It's choosing yourself again and again, even when no one is watching. For the first time in my life, the future feels open not because it's perfect, but because it's finally mine. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It didn't announce itself with a sudden feeling of happiness or relief. Instead, it crept in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments I hadn't noticed in years. Like the morning I woke up and realized I hadn't checked my phone overnight. For so long, my sleep had been shallow, interrupted by the fear that I might miss a call, another emergency, another demand, another reminder that someone else's crisis depended on me. That fear had shaped my nights without my permission. But that morning, my phone lay untouched on the nightstand, and I felt no rush of panic when I reached for it. Just silence. At first, the silence felt suspicious, unnatural, as if something terrible was waiting just beyond it. I found myself bracing for impact even when nothing was happening, my body still trained to expect chaos. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the source is gone. It lingers, hiding in habits and reflexes. I started noticing how often I apologized at work, with friends, even to strangers. Sorry had become my default response, a way to soften my presence, to take up less space. One afternoon, after apologizing to a coworker for asking a perfectly reasonable question, I caught myself mid-sentence and stopped. I didn't need to apologize for existing. That realization hit me harder than I expected. The more distance I gained from my family, the clearer certain patterns became. I saw how often my kindness had been used against me, how my sense of responsibility had been weaponized. I had confused loyalty with self-erasure, believing that love meant enduring anything without complaint. It took time to accept that this belief hadn't come from nowhere. It had been taught, reinforced, rewarded. Letting go of it felt like unlearning a language I'd spoken my entire life. Friends noticed the change before I did. They said I seemed calmer, more present, less tense. I laughed more easily. I made plans without immediately canceling them out of guilt. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't built around sacrifice. But there were still moments that caught me off guard. I saw a woman in the grocery store who looked like my mother from behind, and my chest tightened before my mind could catch up. I heard my sister's name spoken by a stranger, and my hands curled into fists without my permission. These reactions didn't mean I was failing at healing. They meant I was human. I learned to sit with those feelings instead of fighting them, to acknowledge the grief without letting it pull me backward. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in my apartment, I found a photo I hadn't seen in years. It was of my father, standing in our backyard, smiling at the camera with his hands on his hips. I sat on the floor and stared at it for a long time. For years, I had told myself I was honoring him by holding the family together at all costs. But looking at his face now, I wondered if that was ever what he would have wanted. I didn't think he would have wanted me to disappear. That thought brought a strange kind of peace. It allowed me to release a promise that had been suffocating me since I was 16. I could still love my father without destroying myself in his name. Around that time, I made a small but significant decision. I changed my emergency contact. It seems trivial, but it wasn't. For most of my adult life, my mother's name had been there by default, unquestioned. Replacing it felt like crossing an invisible line. When I saved the change, I sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. I was choosing myself. Work began to feel different too. Without the constant drain of financial stress, I had more energy, mental and emotional, to invest in my own growth. I took on new responsibilities, spoke up in meetings, applied for opportunities I would have dismissed before, not because I suddenly felt fearless, but because I was no longer carrying everyone else's fear with me. I still thought about my mother and sister from time to time, mostly in fragments, memories that surfaced without warning. I didn't miss them the way I once thought I would. What I missed was the idea of who I believed they were. Accepting that distinction was painful, but freeing. I stopped checking up on them entirely. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Knowing less became a form of peace. Their choices, their struggles, their consequences, those belonged to them now. The world didn't collapse because I stepped back. In fact, it kept turning, just as it always had. One afternoon, sitting alone in a quiet cafe, I caught myself smiling for no reason. Not because something extraordinary had happened, but because nothing was wrong. That was when I realized how rare that feeling had been in my life. I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I wasn't calculating how much I could afford to give away. I was simply present, enjoying a moment that belonged entirely to me. That, I learned, is what freedom actually feels like. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. The past still exists. It always will. But it no longer defines me. It no longer dictates my worth or my role in other people's lives. I carry it as knowledge now, not as a burden. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that compassion without boundaries is a slow form of self-destruction, and choosing yourself doesn't make you cruel, it makes you honest. I didn't lose my family the day I walked away. I lost the illusion that I was ever truly safe sacrificing myself for people who saw my love as a resource. And in letting go of that illusion, I gained something far more valuable. a life that is finally my own. There was a point, months after everything had ended, when I began to believe the story was truly over. Not in a dramatic sense, no final speeches, no last confrontations, but in the quiet way endings actually happen, when days stack on top of each other and nothing explodes. Then my phone rang. I was cooking dinner, something simple, when an unfamiliar number lit up the screen. I ignored it at first. Old habits urged me to answer, to be available, but I had learned the difference between urgency and intrusion. The number called again. Then a third time. I turned off the stove and picked up the phone, already bracing myself. "Hello?" There was a pause, followed by a voice I hadn't heard in months, softer than I remembered, smaller. "It's me," my mother said. I didn't speak. "I just wanted to check on you," she continued. "I heard you're doing well." The sentence landed strangely, not as concern, as reconnaissance. "I'm fine," I said calmly. "I know you're angry," she said quickly. "And I understand why. But families go through things." I closed my eyes. This was familiar territory, the slow pivot from accountability to obligation, the suggestion that time itself erased harm, that shared blood was a permission slip. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm not interested in talking." Her breath hitched. "Audrey, please. I'm your mother." "I know," I replied. "That's why this hurts. And that's why it ends here." She tried again. Apologies without specifics. Regret without responsibility. Promises that felt like echoes of things I'd heard before. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself. I said goodbye. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of holding a boundary that once would have felt impossible. I stood in my kitchen, breathing slowly, letting the moment pass without chasing it. That night, I slept just fine. It struck me then how much had changed. Once, a call like that would have unraveled me for weeks. I would have replayed every word, wondered if I'd been too harsh, questioned whether I should try harder. Now, the emotions came and went like weather felt, acknowledged, then released. That didn't mean I was healed. It meant I was healing. The truth about recovery is that it doesn't erase the past. It teaches you how to carry it without letting it cut you open every time you move. Some days were still heavy. Certain anniversaries stirred memories I couldn't control. The sound of my hometown's name could still make my chest tighten. But those moments no longer dictated my choices. I began to notice how often people tested my boundaries in small, ordinary ways. Coworkers asking for last-minute favors, friends venting without checking in, acquaintances assuming my time was flexible simply because I didn't complain. Before, I would have said yes automatically. Now, I paused. Sometimes I still said yes because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated. Other times, I said no. And the world didn't end. People adjusted. Some drifted away. Others respected me more. That realization was quietly revolutionary. I started investing in things I'd postponed for years. I enrolled in a class I'd always been curious about. I upgraded my apartment, not extravagantly, but thoughtfully choosing furniture that felt like me, not what was cheapest or easiest. I took walks without headphones, letting my thoughts exist without distraction. The space inside my mind felt different, wider, less crowded. I thought about Whitney once, late at night, when a memory surfaced without warning. We were kids again, sitting on the floor of our shared bedroom, laughing over something small and unimportant. For a moment, grief washed over me, not for who she had become, but for what might have been. Then the feeling passed. I didn't push it away. I didn't dwell on it. I let it be what it was, a reminder that love and harm can coexist, and that acknowledging one doesn't excuse the other. I learned that forgiveness, if it comes at all, doesn't always arrive as reconciliation. Sometimes it shows up as indifference, sometimes as peace. One afternoon, my therapist asked me a question that stopped me cold. "If you met your 16-year-old self today," she said, "what would you tell her?" I didn't answer right away. I pictured myself standing in that funeral home, staring at my father's coffin, making promises I didn't understand yet, I imagined placing a hand on that girl's shoulder, feeling how tense she already was, how determined to be strong. I'd tell her she's allowed to live, I said finally. That protecting others doesn't mean abandoning herself. Saying it out loud felt like closing a circle I'd been trapped in for half my life. I no longer measured my worth by how much I gave. I no longer believed love had to hurt to be real. And I no longer felt responsible for fixing what other people refused to face. That doesn't make me cold. It makes me free. Some stories end with justice served, villains punished, lives neatly restored. Mine didn't end that way. It ended with quiet mornings, honest choices, and the slow rebuilding of a self I'd neglected for too long. And that ending, subtle, steady, earned, is the one I choose every day. I used to think closure was something dramatic, a final conversation, an apology that changed everything, some moment where the past loosened its grip all at once and let me go. That's not how it happened. Closure came to me slowly, disguised as distance. Months passed without incident. No calls, no messages slipping through blocked numbers, no secondhand updates reaching me through people who meant well but didn't know where the line was anymore. Life continued in a way that felt almost suspiciously calm. And for the first time, I allowed myself to enjoy that calm without waiting for it to be taken away. I noticed how different my body felt. The tension I'd carried in my shoulders for years had softened. I wasn't grinding my teeth in my sleep anymore. My breathing felt deeper, fuller, as if my lungs finally trusted that there was enough air to go around. It amazed me how much of my physical discomfort had been tied to emotional survival. One afternoon, while reorganizing a closet I'd been avoiding, I found an old box tucked behind a stack of winter coats. Inside were pieces of my life I hadn't looked at in years: school notebooks, photos, letters my father had written when I was younger. I sat on the floor and opened one of them. His handwriting was careful, slightly slanted. He'd written about small things, how proud he was of me, how much potential he saw in my stubborn determination. There was no mention of sacrifice, no expectation that I would replace him or hold the family together. I cried then, not with the sharp grief I'd known before, but with something softer. Regret, maybe, or relief. I realized I had been honoring a version of responsibility that no one had ever actually asked of me. I had built my identity around a promise formed in shock and grief, then spent years punishing myself for it. Letting that go felt like setting down a weight I didn't know I was still carrying. Around that time, my attorney called with a final update. Everything had been settled. The paperwork was complete. There would be no more hearings, no more obligations, no more loose ends. "This chapter is officially closed," he said. I thanked him and hung up, sitting quietly for a long moment afterward. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. That feeling stayed with me as I moved through my days. Not numbness, not detachment, just a sense that something had reached its natural end. The story no longer needed my energy to continue. People often ask me now, carefully, hesitantly, if I miss my family. The honest answer is complicated. I miss the idea of what family was supposed to be. I miss the safety I believed I had, even if it was an illusion. I miss the version of myself who thought love was simple and unconditional. But I don't miss the fear. I don't miss the guilt. I don't miss the exhaustion of trying to earn my place through suffering. That distinction matters. I learned that missing someone doesn't mean you need to let them back into your life. Grief and boundaries can coexist. Love doesn't require proximity, and forgiveness doesn't require access. Those lessons didn't come easily. They were learned through repetition, through choosing myself again and again, even when it felt uncomfortable. I stopped over-explaining my decisions. I stopped seeking validation for boundaries that were mine to set. When people questioned why I didn't try harder to reconcile, I simply said, "Because peace matters to me." Most people didn't argue after that. On the rare occasions when my thoughts drifted back to Whitney, I no longer felt the sharp sting of betrayal. Instead, I felt a distant sadness, less about what she did and more about what she never became, about the choices she made when accountability was placed in front of her. I accepted that her path was not my responsibility to redirect. One evening, While walking home after work, I caught my reflection in a dark storefront window. I paused, surprised by what I saw. I looked lighter, not younger, exactly, just more present, more solid in my own skin. For years, my sense of self had been tied to usefulness, how much I could endure, how much I could give, how quietly I could carry pain. Without that framework, I had worried there would be nothing left. I was wrong. What emerged in its place was someone more honest, someone who could feel empathy without drowning in it, someone who understood that strength isn't measured by how much you can survive, but by how well you protect what matters. I started mentoring a younger colleague at work around that time. She reminded me of myself at 16, eager, capable, already taking on too much. One afternoon, she apologized for needing help, the words tumbling out in a way I recognized too well. I stopped her gently. "You don't have to apologize for asking," I said. "You're allowed to need support." End quote. She looked at me like I'd said something radical. In that moment, I realized how far I'd come. The cycle didn't end with me walking away from my family. It ended with me refusing to pass the same lesson forward that worth is earned through pain. That realization brought a quiet sense of purpose I hadn't expected. I don't know what the future holds in precise terms. I don't need to. For the first time, uncertainty doesn't scare me. It feels open, full of possibility rather than threat. I wake up most mornings without a knot in my stomach. I make plans without calculating who might need something from me. I live a life that is shaped by choice instead of obligation. And when I think back to that woman standing in a parking lot, her finger hovering over a transfer button, convinced that love meant self-destruction, I feel compassion, not shame. She did the best she could with what she knew. Now, I know better. And knowing better has changed everything. There was a moment, long after everything had settled, when I realized I no longer told the story to explain myself. At first, whenever someone asked why I lived alone, why I never mentioned my family, why I seemed so careful with my time, I felt an urge to justify my choices. I would soften the truth, edit it down, frame it in ways that made other people more comfortable. I thought that was kindness. It wasn't. It was fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being misunderstood, fear that if I told the truth plainly, someone might decide I was too harsh, too unforgiving, too much. Letting go of that fear took longer than walking away ever did. I noticed the shift one evening at a small gathering with coworkers. Someone casually asked where my family lived, and for the first time, I didn't feel the familiar tightening in my chest. I answered simply, without rehearsing, without apology. "We're not in contact," I said. No explanation followed. No story. No defense. And the world didn't collapse. That was when I understood that healing isn't just about what you leave behind, it's about what you stop carrying into new spaces. As time passed, my memories began to reorganize themselves. Events that once felt tangled and chaotic started to make sense in a way they never had before. I could see the patterns clearly now, not as accusations, but as facts. I saw how often I had been praised for being strong, when what people really meant was quiet. How often my reliability had been celebrated without anyone questioning the cost. How quickly responsibility had been placed on my shoulders simply because I didn't resist it. Understanding this didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. I began to recognize those patterns elsewhere, in conversations, in workplaces, even in friendships. When someone leaned too heavily on my willingness to help without offering anything in return, I noticed. When expectations went unspoken but assumed, I paused. And when something felt wrong, I trusted that feeling instead of overriding it. That trust was new, fragile at first, but it grew stronger each time I honored it. One afternoon, I found myself back in my hometown for work, passing the exit I used to take without thinking. I didn't feel the urge to turn off the highway this time. I kept driving, my eyes forward, my hands steady on the wheel. The past no longer pulled at me. That didn't mean I forgot it. Forgetting isn't the goal. Integration is. I carry what happened as knowledge now, not as a wound that dictates my movements, but as a map that helps me avoid familiar traps. I think about my mother less and less. When I do, it's without the sharp edge of anger. I don't imagine confrontations or explanations anymore. There's nothing left to say that would change what happened, and I no longer need validation from someone who never truly saw me. As for my sister, the thought of her no longer triggers the same ache. I've accepted that some people grow by avoiding accountability, and others grow by facing it. We chose different paths long before I ever realized it. Acceptance doesn't mean approval, it means release. There were moments, especially early on, when I wondered if I should have handled things differently. If I should have tried longer, explained more, sacrificed one last time. Those thoughts still surface occasionally, but they no longer linger. I recognize them for what they are: echoes of conditioning, not truths. I learned that guilt is often loudest when it no longer has a place to live. The biggest change, though, wasn't in how I thought about my family. It was in how I thought about myself. For years, my identity had been wrapped around endurance. I believed my value came from how much I could withstand without breaking. Rest felt indulgent. Joy felt undeserved unless it was postponed indefinitely. Now, rest feels necessary. Joy feels earned simply by existing. I allow myself small pleasures without calculating their justification. I take time off without apology. I say no when something costs me more than it offers. These aren't grand acts of rebellion, they're quiet declarations of worth. I used to believe strength meant staying. Now I know it often means leaving. Not in anger, not dramatically, but firmly, with clarity and intention. One night, while journaling, I wrote something that surprised me. I don't want my story to be about what they did to me. I want it to be about what I chose afterward. That realization reframed everything. What happened to me matters. It shaped me. It hurt me. But it does not define the sum of who I am. The choices I made once I saw the truth, that's where my agency lives. I began sharing parts of my story more openly after that, not as a warning or a confession, but as an offering. People responded in ways I didn't expect. Some saw themselves in it. Others admitted things they'd never said out loud. It reminded me that silence often protects harm, while honesty handled carefully creates connection. I'm more selective now about who I let close. Not closed off, just intentional. I value reciprocity. I pay attention to how people respond when I express needs instead of meeting theirs. And when someone shows me who they are, I believe them the first time. That lesson alone has changed the quality of my life. Looking back, I don't regret loving deeply. I regret believing that love required my disappearance. But regret, like grief, is something you move through, not something you live inside forever. Today, my life is quieter, smaller in some ways, but it's also fuller, truer, built on consent instead of obligation. And when I think of the girl, I used to be the one who believed her worth depended on how much she gave. I don't feel anger or embarrassment. I feel gratitude. She survived long enough for me to learn how to live. And that, more than anything else, is the ending I choose to keep writing. There came a point when I realized I wasn't just healing anymore. I was changing. Healing is about tending to wounds, learning how to breathe around pain, how to soften its sharpest edges. Change is something else entirely. Change is what happens after the wounds stop demanding your full attention, when you begin to notice who you are becoming in the quiet that follows. For a long time, I thought survival was the finish line. If I could just make it through the worst of it, through the betrayal, the exhaustion, the grief, I believed I would arrive at some version of peace. What I didn't understand was that survival is only the beginning. Living comes later. That realization didn't arrive in a single moment. It revealed itself in fragments. Like the day I caught myself making a decision without mentally checking how it might affect someone else. I was choosing between 2 job opportunities, weighing the pros and cons purely on what felt right to me. No guilt, no internal negotiation, just preference. I remember sitting back in my chair afterward, slightly stunned by how natural it felt. Or the evening, I declined an invitation, not because I was tired or busy, but simply because I didn't want to go. I sent the message, set my phone down, and waited for the familiar wave of anxiety to hit. It didn't. Instead, I felt grounded, certain, at ease with my own choice. Moments like that accumulated quietly, reshaping my sense of self in ways I couldn't have imagined a year earlier. I began to see how deeply my old identity had been tied to reaction rather than intention. I had spent so many years responding to emergencies, smoothing conflicts, anticipating needs, that I'd never learned how to move forward without something chasing me. Now, nothing was chasing me. That freedom came with its own kind of discomfort. Without constant urgency, there was space wide, open space, and at times it felt overwhelming. I had to learn how to sit in it without filling it with self-imposed obligations. I had to learn how to be alone with myself, not as a punishment, but as a choice. I started taking long walks without destinations, letting my thoughts wander instead of corralling them into productivity. I journaled not to process trauma, but to explore curiosity questions about who I was becoming, what I wanted to grow into, what kind of life felt honest to me now. The answers weren't dramatic. They were steady. I wanted a life built on mutual care, not debt disguised as love. I wanted relationships where support flowed both ways, where my presence wasn't measured by usefulness. I wanted work that challenged me without consuming me, rest that didn't require justification, joy that didn't feel borrowed. These desires felt almost radical after a lifetime of self-denial. Occasionally, doubt still surfaced. Late at night, old questions would drift back in, uninvited. Was I too harsh? Did I walk away too easily? Could I have done more? But those questions no longer held the same power. I could sit with them now, examine them gently, and see the assumptions beneath them, the belief that my responsibility was endless, that my worth was conditional. Once you see a belief clearly, it loses its ability to control you. I noticed how my body responded differently to stress. Situations that once would have sent me spiraling now felt manageable, not because they were easier, but because I trusted myself to handle them without sacrificing my well-being. That trust was new, and it felt like learning to stand on solid ground after years of walking on ice. One afternoon, while organizing files on my computer, I stumbled across an old spreadsheet, a meticulous record of every dollar I had sent over the years. For a moment, my chest tightened. Then I closed the file and deleted it. Not out of denial, out of completion. I didn't need that record anymore to validate what I'd been through. The experience lived in me now, integrated, no longer demanding proof. I thought about my father again around that time, about how his death had shaped so many of my choices without my realizing it. For years, I had equated responsibility with love, endurance with loyalty. But as I reflected on the man, he was not the absence he left behind, but the presence he had once been. I understood something important. He had loved fiercely, yes, but he had also laughed, rested, dreamed. He hadn't lived solely for obligation. I allowed myself to imagine what he might say to me now, seeing the life I was building. I don't think he would want gratitude or sacrifice. I think he would want peace. That thought stayed with me, steadying and warm. As I moved further away from the version of myself shaped by survival, I became more intentional about the future. I set boundaries early in new relationships. I asked questions. I paid attention to how people responded when I expressed needs instead of meeting theirs. Some connections deepened, others faded. I let both happen without resistance. For the first time, I felt like the author of my own life, rather than a character reacting to everyone else's plot. I no longer introduce myself through struggle. I don't define my past by what was taken from me, but by what I reclaimed. My story is no longer about betrayal, it's about awakening. And awakening, I've learned, isn't loud. It's the quiet confidence of knowing when to stay and when to leave. It's the ability to choose rest without guilt, to say no without apology, to love without disappearing. There are still days when sadness surfaces unexpectedly. Healing doesn't erase memory, but memory, when integrated, becomes wisdom rather than weight. I carry that wisdom with me now, not as armor, but as guidance. Looking ahead, I don't have everything figured out. I don't need to. The future feels open in a way that's inviting rather than intimidating. Whatever comes next, I know I will meet it as myself, not as someone else's savior, not as a stand-in for loss, not as a solution to problems I didn't create, just as me. And that, after everything, feels like the greatest act of reclamation of all. There is a strange moment that comes after a long storm, when you realize you're no longer watching the sky for clouds. I didn't notice when it happened at first. There was no announcement, no sudden rush of confidence. Just one ordinary afternoon when I caught myself thinking about something completely unrelated to my past and realized it had been hours since my family crossed my mind. That was new. For so long, my thoughts had revolved around them like a reflex. Even after I walked away, even after the legal consequences and the silence, part of me stayed alert, as if the story might restart at any moment. I had learned to live in anticipation of disruption. Peace felt temporary, conditional. But that afternoon, peace simply existed. It startled me more than the chaos ever had. I was sitting by the window of my apartment, watching people pass on the sidewalk below, each of them carrying lives I would never know. And for the first time, I felt completely separate from the version of myself who had once believed it was her job to hold everything together. That separation didn't come from anger. It came from understanding. I finally understood that what I had lost wasn't a family, it was an illusion of safety that had been built on my silence and compliance. The truth was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying. You cannot fix a relationship that only survives when one person disappears inside it. Once I accepted that, the urge to explain myself vanished. There were no more imaginary conversations in my head where I tried to say the right thing, no more rehearsed arguments, no more unanswered questions looping endlessly. I didn't need closure from them anymore because I had already closed the door internally. And that kind of closure is irreversible. I still encountered reminders, of course. A street name that matched my hometown. A song my mother used to play in the kitchen. A random memory triggered by nothing at all. But those reminders no longer hijacked my nervous system. They passed through me like weather instead of becoming the climate. That was how I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Around that time, someone at work asked me a question that surprised me. "How did you get so good at handling pressure?" they said, half joking. "Nothing ever seems to shake you." I smiled politely, but inside, I felt something shift. For years, I had mistaken endurance for strength. I had been praised for staying calm in crisis, for solving problems, for carrying weight without complaint. But now I understood the hidden cost of that praise. I had learned to tolerate far more than I should have. True strength, I realized, wasn't staying calm while being hurt. It was knowing when to walk away. That realization changed how I moved through the world. I stopped trying to prove myself through resilience. I didn't need to be the strong one anymore. I allowed myself to be uncertain, to ask for help, to say when something felt wrong. I let go of the idea that competence required silence. People responded differently to me after that. Some respected it, some didn't know what to do with it. I paid attention. Not everyone is comfortable when you stop being endlessly accommodating. That discomfort told me more than any apology ever could. I also began to notice how differently I spoke to myself. The internal voice that once pushed me relentlessly, "You should try harder, you owe them, you can handle it," had softened. In its place was something steadier, more compassionate. You don't have to earn rest. You don't have to explain your boundaries. You are allowed to change. Those thoughts didn't arrive fully formed. They were practiced, repeated, sometimes resisted. But over time, they became familiar, like a language I was finally fluent in. I thought about my mother and sister less as villains and more as people who made choices I could not follow. That distinction mattered. It freed me from needing them to be monsters in order to justify my leaving. They were simply unsafe for me. Understanding that removed the last trace of doubt. I no longer wondered if I would ever reconnect. That question lost relevance once I accepted that reconciliation without accountability is just another form of self-betrayal. Wanting peace doesn't mean reopening doors that cost you your sanity. Peace means protecting what you've built. One evening, as I reorganized my living space, I came across the briefcase I had used that day, the one that never held money, only truth. I considered throwing it away. then stopped. Instead, I placed it back on the shelf, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of courage. That was the moment I understood something else. I wasn't defined by what happened to me. I was defined by the moment I stopped participating in my own erasure. I had rewritten the ending, not with revenge, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Walking away didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. Honest about what I could and could not carry. Honest about what love should and should not require. The life I live now is quieter than the one I imagined when I was younger. Smaller in scale, perhaps, but it's also richer, steadier, rooted in choice rather than obligation. I wake up without bracing myself. I go to sleep without rehearsing disasters. I make decisions based on alignment instead of fear. And when I look ahead, I don't see an empty future. I see space. Space to grow. Space to rest. Space to become someone who is no longer defined by survival. That, to me, is the real ending of this story. Not the confrontation. Not the exposure. Not even the justice. But the quiet, undeniable truth that I am finally living a life that belongs to me, and I will never trade that away again. By the time a year had passed, I understood something I hadn't expected. Distance doesn't erase history, but it does change its volume. What once felt deafening had faded into a low, manageable hum. The memories were still there, clear enough when I chose to look at them, but they no longer ambushed me. They waited. And that alone felt like proof that I had reclaimed control over my own life. I noticed it most in the small moments. When an unexpected expense came up and my first instinct was no longer panic, but calculation. When my phone rang late at night and I didn't feel a jolt of fear shoot through my body. When I made plans months in advance without mentally adding an asterisk for emergencies that weren't mine to handle anymore. For years, I had lived as if the future were a luxury I couldn't afford. Now, the future felt ordinary, and that was extraordinary. I began to understand how deeply I had been conditioned to equate worth with usefulness, how often I had mistaken endurance for virtue. Letting go of that belief didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, each one peeling back an assumption I'd carried without question. One afternoon, a colleague asked if I could stay late to help with a project. I checked my calendar, considered my energy, and said no. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. The simplicity of that choice startled me. The sky didn't fall. No one was angry. Nothing bad happened. That was when I realized how much of my fear had been inherited rather than earned. Occasionally, fragments of the past still surfaced in unexpected ways. A particular scent, a phrase someone used casually, a familiar pattern of emotional manipulation that I now recognized instantly. Instead of pulling me backward, these moments reinforced how far I'd come. Recognition is a kind of power. I stopped framing my story as something that happened to me. I began to see it as something I had moved through. That shift changed everything. It returned agency to places where there had only been obligation before. I didn't become cynical. I didn't harden. If anything, I became more discerning. I learned that empathy without boundaries is self-abandonment, and boundaries without empathy are isolation. The balance between the two is where real connection lives. I cultivated friendships that honored that balance. Relationships where support was mutual, not transactional. Where care didn't come with a silent ledger attached. These connections felt different, lighter, more honest. They didn't demand performance. I realized how rare that had been in my life before. Sometimes, people asked me if I ever felt guilty. The question always surprised me. Guilt implies wrongdoing. It assumes I had done something immoral by choosing myself. Once I understood that, the guilt lost its grip. What I had felt for years wasn't guilt, it was conditioning. And conditioning can be unlearned. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't genuinely curious. I stopped shrinking my truth to make it more palatable. I allowed my story to exist without needing to convince anyone of its validity. That freedom was quiet but profound. I also allowed myself to feel pride, not in the dramatic moments, the confrontation, the exposure, but in the quiet consistency of choosing myself afterward. In the days when no one was watching, when there was no applause or validation, and I still honored my boundaries, that's where real change lives. One evening, while walking home, I passed a family laughing together on a park bench. The sight stirred something in me, not envy, not sadness, but a gentle recognition of loss. I acknowledged it, then let it pass. I didn't tell myself stories about what could have been. I didn't bargain with the past. I had already made peace with it. The hardest lesson I learned wasn't about betrayal or manipulation. It was about identity. For most of my life, I had been someone's solution, someone's backup plan, someone's safety net. Letting go of that role felt like stepping into open air without a harness, terrifying at first, then liberating. I discovered parts of myself that had been buried under responsibility. Curiosity, playfulness, ambition that wasn't fueled by fear. I pursued interests simply because they brought me joy, not because they served a purpose beyond that. Joy, I learned, doesn't need to be earned. Looking back now, I can see how everything I endured shaped me not into someone harder, but into someone clearer. Clear about what I will tolerate, clear about what I will not, clear about the fact that love should not require self-sacrifice as proof of loyalty. I don't wish harm on my mother or my sister. I don't rehearse their failures or imagine their regrets. Their story continues without me, and that's exactly how it should be. My story continues too. It's quieter than the one I used to live, but it's also truer, built on intention instead of reaction, on choice instead of fear, on a sense of self that no longer depends on how much I give away. If there's one thing I would say to anyone who recognizes themselves in my journey, it's this. Walking away is not abandonment when staying requires you to disappear. Choosing yourself is not cruelty when the alternative is self-destruction. I didn't lose my family. I found myself. And that discovery, hard-won, deeply personal, and irrevocable, is something I will protect for the rest of my life. Before I end this story, I want to pause for a moment, not to relive the pain, but to understand what it all meant. This was never just a story about money or even betrayal. It was a story about how easily love can be twisted into obligation, and how kindness, when it has no boundaries, can quietly destroy the very person offering it. For years, I believed that endurance was proof of devotion, that sacrifice was the price of belonging. But the truth is, real love does not demand your silence, your fear, or your future. What changed everything wasn't revenge or punishment, it was clarity. The moment I stopped asking, "How much more can I give?" and started asking, "Why am I the only one paying the cost?" That question became the beginning of freedom. If you're listening to this and you see pieces of yourself in my story, if you've ever felt trapped by guilt, family pressure, or the belief that walking away makes you selfish, I hope this reminds you that choosing yourself is not a betrayal, it's survival. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Stories like this are shared here to help us reflect, heal, and feel less alone. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to Revenge Drama House. Your support allows this space to continue telling honest, human stories that matter. And remember, your life is yours. Protect it,